At my wife's funeral, I stayed silent. I stood in a black coat, listening to the hollow speeches, listening as my son whispered to his wife that now everything would be his. I didn't say a word. No one knew that 3 years before her death, we had bought a second house, in my name. No one knew she had left me an account he would never be able to touch. A week after the funeral, my son said, "Pack your things. The house is sold." I just nodded, because I had already packed, but not for where they thought. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Richard Hargraves. I was 72 years old when I buried my wife, Mary. For most of my adult life, I had been a firefighter in Flagstaff, Arizona, a job that gave me routine, discipline, and the clearest sense of purpose I ever knew. But even after I retired, I kept my mornings sharp and early. I liked to get up with the sun, brew coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, and sit on the back porch before the world fully woke. That's where I sat the morning after the funeral, in my old corduroy jacket, hands still smelling faintly of the cedar from the coffin I'd chose. The air had changed. Not the weather, not the temperature, the air inside me. I was still breathing, but it no longer felt like it was doing much good. I wasn't sad in the way people expected, not loud grief, no trembling hands, no tears in my shirt sleeves. It was quiet. Just a hollowing out, like someone had scooped me clean with a flat shovel and set me back on the porch with no insides left. She had been the center of every day, even the dull ones, especially the dull ones. We lived in the same house for 48 years, a modest place with a porch that creaked in the corners and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of lemon oil and tomato sauce. Mary used to hum while she cooked, songs I never recognized, but I knew the way they changed with her mood. She left behind 1,000 small things, a teacup with a chip in it, a dented watering can by the fence, a stack of letters I was never supposed to read, rubber-banded and yellowing in the top drawer of her nightstand. After the funeral, I came home alone. No one followed me back. The kids had their own errands, their own families. No one asked if I needed anything. That was fine. I wasn't sure what I would have said anyway. I stood in the doorway for almost 10 minutes, staring into a living room that no longer felt mine. Her blanket was folded too neatly on the couch. The books she'd left half-read sat frozen mid-thought. The silence in that house felt staged, like the set of a play after the curtain falls. I walked through the house room by room, not touching anything, just taking it in. Her perfume still lingered faintly in the hallway. That small sweetness undid me more than any speech at the church. It wasn't that she was gone. It was that she had left so gently, without fuss, and everything had quietly agreed with her absence. I tried to sleep in our bed that first night. I lay on her side, where the mattress still dipped inward. I ran my hand over the pillow, then turned away from it. But sleep didn't come. Not because of pain, not because of nightmares, but because I no longer understood what the point of sleeping was. There was no routine left, no reason to rise. The next day, I woke before sunrise out of habit, not need. And again, I made the coffee, sat outside, and watched the sky turn from ash to blue. I didn't cry. I didn't want pity. What I wanted was something that couldn't be named. A return, maybe. Not just of her, but of something lost long before she died. The days had been slipping through our fingers for years. She had been shrinking slowly. Less talk, less movement, less appetite. And I had tried to fill the space with chores, repairs, old movies. It didn't help. Nothing helped. The phone rang the second morning. A neighbor offering condolences. I let it ring. Then another call, from my son, Daniel. I stared at his name on the screen and let that one go too. I wasn't ready for conversation. I wasn't ready to hear the clatter of his world rubbing up against mine. He had always been too fast, too loud, even as a boy, especially as a man. I spent those first few days in silence. I ate toast without butter, drank black coffee, and sat in the living room like a ghost haunting his own house. I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't answer the door when someone knocked. I wrote nothing in my notebook, just the date and one word beneath it. Still. There were things I could have done, arrangements, legal things, decisions to make, but I didn't move toward any of them. Instead, I began to wander through the attic. I opened boxes we hadn't touched in decades. I found photos of Mary from before we married, laughing with friends I never met, her hair pinned up with little silver combs. I found an envelope addressed to her in handwriting I didn't recognize, postmarked from San Francisco in 1972. I didn't open it. Some things are meant to remain unknown, but I held it for a long time. The fourth night, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the calendar. The days ahead stretched out blank, like a field with no fences. I began to draw small X's in the corners. Nothing marked, just a way of proving I was still present, still somewhere. Grief is not fire. That was the first real thought I wrote down. It's smoke. It finds its way into every crack, every fold of your shirt, every breath you take. It doesn't burn. You think you've escaped it, but it stays, lingers, sinks into the walls, and you live with it, the way you live with an old injury in the cold. I began to sleep in the guest room after that, not because it was easier, but because it didn't smell like her, because it didn't know her. It was neutral, cold, empty, and that made it simpler. I needed simple. I needed walls that didn't ask anything of me. The fifth morning, I opened the blinds and stared out at the street. Same garbage bins, same crooked mailbox, same dog barking in the distance. But it all felt tilted, like a world slightly off kilter. I wasn't sure if it was me or everything else. I poured cereal and didn't finish it. I sat in the sun and let it touch my hands. I wondered how long it would take before someone noticed I hadn't answered any calls. Then I realized it didn't matter. They had lives. I was just the old man in the house now, and that was all right, for now. I made a list that day. Things I wanted to keep. Not objects, not heirlooms, just moments. The way she touched my shoulder when she passed behind me. The sound of her sandals on the tile. The way she said my name when she was half asleep. I wrote them down, slowly, afraid that naming them might erase them somehow. But it felt important, like I was building a fire again, not of heat, but of memory. By the end of that week, I had said almost nothing out loud. My voice felt distant, unused, like a tool packed away in a garage for too long. I wasn't afraid. I was waiting, not for something to happen, but for the world to adjust around the space she left behind. And in that stillness, something inside me shifted. Not much, just a click, like the soft turn of a safe lock, something waiting behind the silence, something I didn't even know I had left. I had always believed that a house could hold a memory, not just in photographs or old furniture, but in the shape of a dent on the floor, the way the light moved across the living room at 5 p.m, or the soft creak of the stairs under a familiar foot. That house, my house, had once been a quiet, steady companion. It had seen 48 Christmases, 3 generations of handprints on the hallway walls, and countless nights where the only sound was Mary's soft breathing beside me. But after she was gone, the house changed. Or maybe I was the one who changed, and the house simply revealed itself. It started slowly. My son Daniel came by a few days after the funeral. He had a key, of course. I heard the door open before I even got up from the chair. He didn't knock. He walked in like it had always been his. He brought his wife, Jenna, and their daughter, Molly. They arrived with voices that bounced too loudly off the walls, with the scent of expensive cologne and synthetic fruit from some plastic air freshener they must have stuck in the hallway. They moved through the house like it was a showroom. Jenna opened drawers, peeked into cabinets, commented on the wallpaper, and frowned at the curtains. She said the word update a lot. Daniel nodded. They used phrases like maximize the space and bring in more light. They didn't ask me what I thought. They assumed I would nod along. I didn't nod. I just sat at the table, watching the lines between mine and theirs begin to blur. Jenna made her first real move when she brought in 3 cardboard boxes and labeled them donate, trash, and keep. She placed them in the living room beside Mary's piano, as if categorizing grief into neat compartments was an act of kindness. Daniel moved my recliner out of its spot by the window and said it would be better in the garage for now. They brought in a low, modern couch with stiff cushions that left no room for sinking. I didn't recognize the living room once they finished. The bookshelves were cleared, the framed wedding photos replaced with generic prints of golden wheat fields and abstract shapes. They offered me the guest room, said it would be quieter there, more convenient. My old bedroom, the one Mary and I had shared, became the nursery again. They were thinking of having another baby. Jenna painted the walls a soft pastel green. My clothes were moved without my help. My shaving kit was placed in a drawer next to a hairdryer that didn't belong to anyone I knew. I found my favorite flannel shirt shoved into a plastic bin in the garage, next to a pile of worn-out sneakers and a broken lamp. Dinner was no longer something I made. Jenna had a subscription to some meal delivery service. Tiny boxes arrived with color-coded instructions and ingredients measured to the gram. The kitchen became hers. I wasn't told not to touch anything, but the glances did the job well enough. My cast iron pan disappeared. So did the spice rack Mary loved. In its place was a row of sleek, unfamiliar containers labeled in minimalist fonts. They talked around me, not to me. Jenna asked Daniel if the couch delivery was scheduled, if the handyman had confirmed, if the cable was getting upgraded. Daniel answered in half-muttered sentences, eyes on his phone. Molly ran through the hall with a tablet blaring cartoons. I sat at the table with a cup of black coffee and watched the family unfold in a home I no longer recognized. At night, I could hear the hum of their conversations through the thin guest room wall. Laughter, television, phones ringing. The house sounded louder, busier, but none of it included me. I became a background fixture. Like the grandfather clock in the hallway, no one wound anymore. I kept to myself, rising early and going to bed before they did. I took to walking the neighborhood in the mornings, when the sky was still gray and quiet. The mailbox, once full of letters for Mary and me, now held flyers and coupons. Nothing with my name on it. Not really. There was a moment, quiet, passing, that stayed with me. I found Mary's gardening gloves in the shed. They were folded neatly on a shelf behind the fertilizer. Dirt still clung to the fingers. I held them for a long time, standing there in the dust and sun. When I brought them back inside and left them on the kitchen counter, I found them later in the trash. No explanation, no comment, just gone. Jenna mentioned an estate sale, casually, offhandedly. It would help declutter, she said, though not to me. I heard her telling Daniel she'd already contacted someone who could assess the antiques. Mary's antique table, the one she inherited from her grandmother, was covered with magazines and coffee mugs. Someone had scratched it. A long, careless drag of something sharp. I said nothing. I ran my finger along the mark, then walked away. Daniel started making decisions about utilities. One morning I realized the thermostat no longer responded. They'd installed a smart system controlled from his phone. I asked for the Wi-Fi password once, scribbled it in my notebook, but it was changed a few days later. The television only played what they queued up from their devices. My old DVDs sat in a dusty box by the door, unwatched, unwanted. One evening, They had guests over, friends of theirs from Jenna's side. I wasn't introduced. I stayed in the guest room, reading an old fire service manual. I heard laughter, footsteps, the clink of wine glasses. At some point, I stepped into the hallway just to stretch my legs and heard someone say, "Oh, is that her father?" I realized they meant me. I realized Jenna had called me her father to simplify things, to erase Mary. In the following days, I noticed framed photos of Mary disappearing, not all at once, just one here, another there, replaced by pictures of Jenna's family, of vacations I hadn't been part of, a beach I'd never seen, a smiling group of faces I didn't know. The last photo of Mary left on the mantel was one of her with Daniel, taken years ago. Even that eventually vanished. I began eating in the garage, not out of bitterness, but because it was quieter. I kept a small electric kettle and a jar of instant coffee next to my toolbox. I used an old folding chair and balanced a plate on my knees. There was dignity in solitude, more than I could find in the echo of their conversations, the digital chirps of their devices, the way they spoke of me as though I were already gone. I tried not to keep count of the days, but I couldn't help it. I started marking small lines in my notebook, not out of desperation, but to measure the slow, deliberate erosion of the life I had built. It didn't collapse. It was peeled away. Strip by strip, smile by smile, decision by decision, until it was no longer mine, until the house that had once held my life became a place I inhabited without belonging. They never said it out loud, but everything in their actions told me the same story. I was a temporary guest in a future they had already planned, and they believed I should be grateful. Grateful for a room, grateful for leftovers, grateful for silence. But I wasn't grateful. I was watching and remembering everything. The first full week after the funeral moved like cold syrup, slow, dense, flavorless. I didn't speak much, not out of protest or stubbornness, but because no one seemed to need my voice. The silence came naturally, like a blanket pulled up over the mouth. Days passed in thick, unremarkable hours. Each morning began the same: early wake, bitter coffee, and a long sit on the edge of the bed, waiting for the rest of the house to stir. I lived around their schedule. I waited for them to clear the kitchen before I stepped in to fill my cup. I waited for the bathroom fan to go silent before I entered to shave. I waited for their car to back out of the driveway before I wandered into the backyard for air. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't announce myself. I moved like a shadow, and that suited everyone fine. Jenna kept the music on in the afternoons, something electronic and rhythmically hollow, like the sound of a heart that had forgotten how to beat with feeling. Daniel worked from home most days. I heard his voice through the walls as he led meetings and gave directions to people I'd never meet. He spoke with confidence and urgency, tones I didn't recognize from the boy I'd raised. The authority in his voice didn't extend to our conversations, maybe because there were none. I avoided eye contact. I listened more than I wanted to. Small comments landed like needles. "The trash didn't go out last night," Jenna said once as she passed my chair, not looking at me. "The garage smells weird," she said another time, standing in the doorway but speaking as if to no one in particular. Daniel had adopted a habit of sighing before talking to me, as if even thinking about including me required energy he didn't have. I started eating less, not out of protest, not to be noticed. I just didn't feel hungry anymore. Food became texture, something to keep my hands occupied. Toast, unsalted crackers, coffee. I found myself chewing slowly, methodically, as if my mouth needed a job to justify its existence. My body shrank a little. Clothes loosened, but no one seemed to notice or care. In the evenings, I sat in the dark living room while the others settled into their shows, their phones, their parallel lives. I didn't want to watch anything. The television was too fast, Too bright, too loud. The characters were all yelling or confessing or making dramatic exits. I preferred the stillness of the hallway, the ticking of the old clock that hadn't been reset since daylight savings, the whisper of the ceiling fan blades cutting through nothing. Jenna rearranged the kitchen one afternoon. I watched from the hallway as she moved the mugs, labeled the spice jars, and tossed out what she called expired nonsense. She held up a small tin of ground cinnamon Mary had bought years ago and wrinkled her nose. "Who even uses this?" she muttered. She threw it in the trash. I didn't move. Later, I retrieved it, washed it, set it quietly in the garage on top of my old toolbox. The label was faded, the lid rusty, but when I opened it, the scent remained. Sweet, warm, stubborn. It was the smell of late October pies, of Mary's hands dusted with flour, of the last normal Thanksgiving before her illness. I closed the lid and left it there. Each day, I recorded nothing in particular, just one line in a notebook I kept folded under the mattress. Tuesday. Clouds moved faster than usual. Wednesday. The hot water ran cold before I was done. Thursday. No one said my name. I wrote these not to remember, but to verify that I had, in fact, been there, that I had survived another rotation of the clock without being erased. Molly, my granddaughter, barely looked at me. She was too young to remember the versions of me that mattered, the versions that lifted her into the sky with strong arms, who carried her on my shoulders through pumpkin patches, who built her a dollhouse from scraps of pine in the shed. Now I was a figure in the background, the quiet one, the old one, the one who didn't interrupt her cartoons. I had the same dream 3 nights in a row. In it, I was standing at the top of the basement stairs, holding a box of Mary's winter coats. The light was out. I couldn't see my feet. I stepped forward, thinking I was on the landing, but the stairs had disappeared. I didn't fall. I just kept stepping forward into the dark, arms full of her clothes, unsure of whether I would ever touch ground again. I woke up breathless every time. The heater clicked on once at midnight. The old sound of it should have comforted me. Instead, I realized the thermostat had been set too low, and they were using space heaters upstairs. I wondered how long it would be before they shut the central system off completely, not to save money, but because I was the only one who used it. I visited Mary's grave once that week, alone. I didn't tell anyone. I walked the 3 miles, not out of ritual, but because I didn't want to explain myself to a cab driver or be seen asking for a ride. The ground was still loose around the marker. No grass yet, just raw earth and a plastic flag someone had left in the corner. I didn't say anything aloud. I just stood there until my knees began to ache and the wind forced my hands into my coat pockets. Back home, Jenna had rearranged the living room again. New pillows, a different rug, my old bookshelf, now in the garage. I stared at the spot it used to occupy. The wall looked brighter without it, more spacious. She was good at creating the illusion of progress. On Saturday, I woke up and found the front door unlocked. I stood there for a long time, one hand on the doorknob, not stepping outside. It was as if the house itself had loosened its grip, not pushing me out, not keeping me in, just indifferent. That indifference frightened me more than hostility ever could. Hostility at least meant someone noticed you. I made a cup of tea instead of coffee. I sat at the table and let it go cold. Then I poured it out, washed the cup, and returned it to the exact same spot in the cabinet. Not one thing changed. That was the pattern. Every action erased itself. Every trace of me was wiped away within hours. The silence became the shape of my day. It curved around the edges of my thoughts. It softened my footsteps. It filled the spaces where once there had been questions, jokes, arguments, love. It was no longer an absence of sound. It was a presence in itself, heavy, settled. They didn't ask me what I was thinking. They didn't ask if I was okay. They didn't ask anything at all, so I gave them what they wanted. Nothing. It happened on a Tuesday. The sky was pale and overcast, the kind of washed-out gray that makes everything feel like it's waiting for something. I had spent most of the morning in the backyard, raking up damp leaves that no one asked me to touch. It wasn't fall anymore, not technically, but the tree in the corner of the yard clung to its last few stubborn leaves and dropped them without rhythm. I raked because it gave my hands something to do, and because no one noticed what I did anymore, unless it inconvenienced them. By midday, I'd changed my shirt and was sitting on the edge of the bed in the guest room. The sunlight came through the blinds in flat strips. There were sounds from upstairs, muffled footsteps, the clinking of glasses, the hum of voices lowered just enough to suggest secrecy, but not enough to fully hide it. I didn't move toward the noise. I had learned not to investigate. People who investigate are usually not meant to be included. A few minutes later, I heard the soft creak of the stairs. The steps were careful, deliberate. Then a knock, 2 short taps against the door frame, not the door itself. I turned my head. Daniel stood there. He didn't lean in. He didn't cross the threshold. He stood like someone trying to break bad news to a neighbor he didn't know well. His hands were in his pockets, eyes moving just enough to avoid mine. There was a pause, a breath. Then came the words. They weren't angry. They weren't cruel. They were delivered with the sterile tone of someone reading from a checklist. The house, he said, had been sold. The buyers were a young couple, expecting their first child. They loved the neighborhood. It would be a fresh start for them. Closing was scheduled in 3 weeks. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. There was no question in his voice, no uncertainty. This wasn't a conversation. It was a conclusion. I wasn't being asked. I was being informed. My role had already been written in ink. He continued, speaking about logistics, where I could go next, what kind of options were available. A few pamphlets had been collected, just in case. He used the word transition. I remember that clearly, like this was a business merger or a new software rollout, not the eviction of a man from the home he had built, brick by quiet brick, over decades. I nodded once, slowly. Not because I agreed, but because silence was safer than protest. If I had spoken, my voice might have cracked, and I didn't want to give them the gift of my pain. He mistook the nod for understanding, or maybe even gratitude, and smiled slightly before stepping back and disappearing down the hallway. I stayed on the bed for a long time. I watched the shadows shift on the ceiling. I listened to the faint noise of a vacuum in another room, the soft chime of a phone notification, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog. The world was unchanged, and that was the strangest part of all. I had always thought moments like these would come with fanfare, thunder, or at least a rush of blood to the head. But instead, it was quiet, dry, administrative. Later that afternoon, I opened the closet. I didn't have much left. A few shirts, 2 pairs of pants, a jacket that no longer zipped all the way. My shoes were lined up neatly, though I hadn't worn the second pair in months. I took down a small canvas duffel bag, one I used during my years at the firehouse, and laid it on the bed. I started packing without thinking, not emotionally, not as a reaction, just mechanically. A shirt, a pair of socks, a photograph of Mary, the one where she was laughing into the wind near the Grand Canyon. It had been stuck in a book for years. I didn't know what I would need. I didn't know where I would go, but I had the sharp instinct that I wouldn't be allowed to linger. In the kitchen, I poured myself a glass of water. Jenna stood at the counter, arranging tulips in a ceramic vase I didn't recognize. She didn't look up. She just shifted slightly to make space for me at the sink, as if I were a stranger in a shared kitchen of a short-term rental. On the refrigerator, a magnet held a sheet of lined paper with a to-do list. Confirm painter, Schedule inspection. Box up garage. Underlined at the bottom. Clear guest room by 20th. I stared at the date. 10 days. That's how long I had been given to vanish. No one had asked about my things. No one had asked where I might want to go. I was an object being relocated. Like a piece of furniture, they couldn't decide whether to donate or sell. They had already made the emotional departure from me months ago. Now they were making it official. That evening, I sat in the backyard again, this time without the rake. The air smelled of damp earth and lawn fertilizer. I looked at the fence I had repaired 15 years ago after a storm blew part of it down. I remembered sanding it with Mary while she hummed something I never identified. I looked at the corner where we once planted tomatoes and where now stood a plastic sandbox full of forgotten toys and ants. The yard didn't remember me anymore. Inside, I heard laughter. Something on the TV, Molly yelling with delight, Jenna shouting over the noise, Daniel's voice, relaxed, content. Life, as they knew it, moved on without pause. The man in the guest room had simply become one of the quieter props in the set, soon to be cleared away to make room for better lighting. I didn't go to dinner that night. I boiled a small potato in the microwave and ate it with salt, alone. No one knocked. No one asked. I cleaned the plate, returned it to the cupboard, and wrote a single line in my notebook. They decided for me. I didn't speak. I found the key later, in a tin box beneath a stack of old utility bills, a key to a door they didn't know existed. I turned it in my hand, like a coin. It felt warm, even though the house was cold. It was not a plan. Not yet. But it was something else, something I hadn't felt in days. Choice, even if quiet, even if small. It was still mine. I left early, before the sun had fully claimed the sky. The house was still asleep, wrapped in that strange silence that hovers just before dawn, like a breath held too long. I didn't make a sound as I moved through the hallway. My shoes were already by the door, my bag packed the night before, and placed beside them like a quiet goodbye. I didn't write a note. I didn't turn off any lights. I didn't lock the door behind me. The street was empty, washed in a bluish hue that made everything look colder than it was. I walked 3 blocks to the bus stop, my breath forming small clouds that vanished almost as soon as they appeared. My knees ached, but not enough to slow me down. The wheels of my duffel bag scraped the pavement rhythmically, a kind of dry whisper that seemed too loud for such a quiet morning. When I boarded the bus, I handed the driver cash, folded precisely and exact. He didn't ask where I was going. He just nodded and pressed the lever that let me pass. I chose a seat in the back, by the window, and watched the familiar streets of my life slide past like someone else's memories. The gas station where I'd once changed a flat tire in the pouring rain. The diner where Mary and I used to split a slice of pie after church. The firehouse, now painted a bright, garish red, like a cartoon version of its former self. I didn't wave. I didn't look back. An hour later, I stepped off in a different part of town. Older, quieter, less impressed with itself. The sidewalk cracked under my feet, and the street lamps still hummed even in daylight. I made my way down an alley behind a row of worn brick buildings until I reached a narrow gate. The key I'd found days earlier fit perfectly into the old brass lock. When it clicked open, I felt it in my chest. The door to the second house creaked when I pushed it open. It smelled of age and wood, and something faintly floral that had lingered long after its source was gone. I stood in the entryway for a long time, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. Dust motes floated in the air like slow snowfall. Everything was just as I remembered, just as we had left it. Mary and I had bought the house quietly, with no fanfare, no announcement. It wasn't a secret out of shame or deception, but out of necessity. We needed a space that wasn't filled with noise and demands and obligations. It had been her idea, really. A backup, she called it. a place to retreat if the world grew too loud. I hadn't understood then how prophetic that decision would be. The furniture was covered in white sheets, soft and slumped like ghosts caught mid-nap. I walked through the living room, trailing my fingers along the fabric. I didn't remove the covers right away. There was something sacred in their stillness. I wanted to remember what it felt like before anything moved again. The kitchen was small, but clean. I found a half-used bottle of dish soap beneath the sink and a faded sponge still resting in the corner of the basin. A single cracked mug sat on the shelf, the one with a faded print of a bear fishing in a stream. It was Mary's favorite. She always said it made her laugh because the bear looked too smug for his own good. I filled it with water and drank slowly, the ceramic warm against my palms. It felt like touching something human again. In the hallway closet, I found the stack of linens we'd left neatly folded, still smelled faintly of lavender. I pulled out a blanket and a pillow and brought them to the small bedroom in the back of the house. The bed was low to the ground and creaked when I sat on it. The mattress was firm, the kind Mary had preferred. She said soft beds made people lazy. I smiled at the memory and stretched out without taking off my shoes. For an hour, I lay still. The room was filled with silence, but a different kind than the silence in Daniel's house. This one wasn't loaded with judgment or expectation. It wasn't waiting for me to speak or leave or conform. It just existed, the way a tree exists, without explanation or apology. Later, I opened the windows. The air was crisp and carried the scent of rain from the night before. A few birds landed on the railing, chirped once, and flew away again. I moved slowly from room to room, opening each curtain, letting the light fall in diagonal patterns on the wooden floor. I didn't clean. I didn't organize. I just let the house breathe. In the study, tucked behind a stack of books, I found the envelope. It had my name written in Mary's handwriting, soft and curved, the way she signed Christmas cards. I didn't open it right away. I sat with it in my lap for a long time, pressing the edges between my fingers, reading my name over and over until it didn't feel like mine anymore. When I finally unfolded the paper inside, I read slowly, one word at a time. Her voice came through the lines, not in sound, but in shape. She wrote of trust, of strength, of knowing this day would come. She wrote about the weight of silence, about the power of having something that no one could take. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "you've already lost more than you should have. But you haven't lost everything." I folded the letter and placed it in my breast pocket. I didn't cry, but my eyes stung, and I knew it wasn't the dust. By afternoon, I had unpacked only the essentials: one pair of shoes, a flannel shirt, the photograph of Mary. I set it on the windowsill in the bedroom, facing east. I didn't bring much, but it didn't feel like I needed more. The house had already begun to reshape around me, not in its structure but in the way it felt, less like a shelter, more like a witness. I made tea in a small pot on the stovetop, sat at the kitchen table, and watched the shadows lengthen on the walls. I didn't think of Daniel or Jenna or Molly. I didn't think of what I had left behind. I thought of the time Mary and I had spent in this house in secret, reading on quiet afternoons, drinking wine from mismatched glasses, building something invisible and inviolable. As night fell, I lit a single candle and placed it on the windowsill, not for ceremony, not for prayer, just for light. I sat beside it, pen in hand, and wrote a single sentence in my notebook. I came back to where the dust remembers me. The house didn't ask anything of me. It didn't make decisions on my behalf. It didn't pretend not to see me. It simply let me return. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I had. The day I walked into the bank, I wore the same jacket I'd worn to Mary's funeral. Not out of symbolism or grief, but because it was the only one I had left that still fit without pulling at the shoulders. The lining had come loose near the wrist, and I kept tucking it back in, pressing it with my fingers like smoothing a paper fold that refused to stay down. I hadn't been inside a bank in over a year. Most things could be done online now, or through someone else. But this wasn't a transaction for the screen. It required a name, a face, a quiet voice that had waited too long. The lobby was nearly empty. A soft jazz instrumental floated through the air like artificial calm. The floor tiles were polished to a gleam that felt more theatrical than clean. I approached the counter, nodded to the young man behind the glass, and handed over a slip of paper I had kept folded in my wallet for months. It had Mary's handwriting on it, the name of a manager, and a date from nearly a year ago. He read it, glanced at the screen in front of him, then asked me to wait. I sat in a chair near the potted plant by the window and stared out at the parking lot. There was a mother unloading a stroller from the back of a minivan, a man in a suit adjusting his tie in the side mirror of his car. Everyone moved with the quiet urgency of people who still believed in forward motion. I just sat, breathing, thinking of nothing. Eventually, a woman appeared in the hallway. Middle-aged, sharp suit, eyes that had seen enough not to blink too often. She greeted me by name. Not Sir, not Mr., just Richard. I followed her into a small glass room with 2 chairs and a desk that looked untouched by human clutter. She closed the door gently behind me and sat down. Then she opened a folder that had been resting on the corner of her desk. What followed wasn't dramatic. There were no surprises, no last-minute complications. It was all precisely as Mary had arranged. A private account, opened in her name, transferred entirely to mine shortly before her diagnosis. A single transaction, locked with instructions to be disclosed only upon my appearance in person. The amount was exact, $480,000. I remember blinking several times, not in shock, but in the slow, stunned recognition of a number that had existed silently, while I moved through the chaos of her illness, her death, and everything that came after. It was not inheritance. It was intention. She had saved that money not as a gift, but as a form of resistance, a shield, something she couldn't say out loud, but had still found a way to give. The woman explained the logistics, transfer options, interest rates, signatures. I listened, nodding at the appropriate times, hands folded in my lap. She asked if I had any questions. I didn't. Everything I needed to know had already been answered by the number alone. She printed documents. I signed them. My name, shaky but legible, appeared 3 times on the line. Each time I wrote it, I felt a piece of myself solidify. Not like armor, but like something rebuilding itself from the inside. When I stepped out of the bank, the sun had shifted, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete. The world looked different, though nothing had changed. I walked slowly, the envelope tucked inside my jacket. The streets were quiet. My steps felt grounded, not heavy, but certain. I wasn't rich, I wasn't powerful, but I was no longer cornered. Back at the house, I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with the envelope laid flat in front of me. I opened it again, reread the numbers, traced the lines of Mary's name. She had planned this. She had looked at our life, its fractures, its silences, the things our son didn't know, and built something strong enough to withstand all of it. Not flashy, not loud, just precise, private. I pulled out my notebook and made a list, not of things to buy, not of expenses, a different kind of list. I will not ask permission. I will not explain where I live. I will not offer help to people who believe I owe them. I will not disappear to make space for others. I will not answer questions that come too late. I tore out the page and placed it in the drawer beside the kitchen sink. It wasn't a manifesto, just a reminder. Later that evening, I sat on the porch with the candle Mary had once bought at a craft fair downtown. It smelled like cedar and oranges. I lit it without ceremony, just to have something warm nearby. The wind had picked up, but I didn't move inside. I let it blow across my face, into my collar, down my sleeves, let it rattle the trees and whisper through the grass. For the first time in a long while, I felt no urge to resist the noise. The account wasn't just money, it was freedom, compressed, waiting. A breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. And now, on that porch, with the sun slipping down behind the houses and the birds settling somewhere I couldn't see, I finally let it go. I exhaled, not from exhaustion, not from relief, but from the certainty that I had something no one could steal, something no one even knew to look for, a life, still mine. I always found myself standing at that window in the early hours, long before the sun made its full appearance. The kitchen in that house, though small, had a certain orientation that caught the morning light at just the right angle. It started as a faint glimmer, then a soft bloom, spilling across the counter and climbing up the walls as the day stretched its fingers. Mary used to call it our second sunrise. The first, she said, was the one the rest of the world saw. The second belonged only to us. In those quiet mornings, I didn't speak. I didn't turn on the lights or shuffle around in search of something to do. I simply stood there, letting the cold tile settle beneath my feet, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee. The window framed a simple view: overgrown hedges, a sagging wooden fence, and a narrow alleyway that led nowhere in particular. But that view was mine, untouched by judgment or intrusion. It didn't change, didn't react, didn't ask anything of me. It simply existed. That, I'd come to learn, was more than most people could manage. I began to notice the smallest movements in that window, the way the shadows fell across the sill, the shifting shapes of birds hopping through the hedges, the condensation that collected in the corners before the glass warmed. There was a rhythm to it all, a silent choreography I hadn't had time to see in the years that passed, like trains with no stops. One morning, I watched a squirrel tear through the fence line with half a granola bar in its mouth, chased by a bird no larger than my fist. I watched the dance unfold for nearly 5 minutes, absurd and unspectacular, but mesmerizing in its freedom. No one had told either creature where to be or what to want. They simply moved, acted, chose. I envied that more than I could admit, even to myself. The countertop beneath the window had aged, its surface marked by faint rings and knife scars from another life. I ran my hand across it sometimes, feeling for the grooves. It was a kind of reading, like Braille for the past. Here was where Mary had sliced apples for pie. There, a burn mark from when she'd left the kettle on too long. On the far end, a dent from when I dropped a hammer trying to hang the spice rack she never liked but kept anyway, because I had made it. Each mark told a story no one else could decipher. The cabinets above the window still held the same mismatched mugs we'd collected over the years. I didn't rearrange them. I didn't wipe the dust. I liked the way they sat, crooked and half forgotten. They reminded me of permanence in small, quiet ways. Not everything had to shine. Not everything had to be useful to be worth keeping. Each morning, after standing there long enough for the light to stretch past the floor, I would sit at the kitchen table and listen to the ticking of the wall clock. The battery was dying, so the second hand moved in uneven spurts, but it still marked time. Imperfect, but faithful. I never replaced the battery. It felt honest that way. Sometimes I would write down what I saw from the window, just a line or two. Sparrow landed on fence post, looked around, flew off. Cat limped through alley with plastic bag stuck to its tail. Sunlight hit the glass, bounced off the toaster, lit up Mary's spoon. These fragments filled the pages of a thin notebook I kept beside the salt. I didn't know why I wrote them. They weren't profound. They wouldn't be read. But it made the days feel like they had edges. The kitchen window faced east, and that meant heat in the summer. I'd open the window in June and let the warm air in while I washed a single plate or boiled water. The glass would fog sometimes, even in heat, and I'd draw shapes on it with my finger. Circles. Lines. Once, I wrote Mary's name in the steam. I stood there until it faded. I rarely used the back door. It was just to the left of the window, a narrow frame with a brass handle that stuck if you didn't twist it just right. The screen was torn in the corner, and a draft would sneak in during the colder months. I left it like that. I liked knowing the world could enter if it wanted to. Not people, not noise, but wind, air, time. One morning, a small envelope was pushed under the door. No stamp, no return address. Just my name, written in block letters. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a quote from a book I didn't recognize. The hardest part isn't being alone, it's being forgotten by those you fed. I didn't need to guess who had sent it. I didn't need to respond. I slid the paper under the spice rack and didn't look at it again. It was in that kitchen, in the company of light and silence, that I began to feel the shape of something return. Not hope, not exactly, more like clarity, a recognition of self that had gone quiet under the weight of obligation. The kitchen didn't rush me. The window didn't ask for stories. They let me be a man in pause. I found myself humming once while slicing an orange. The sound surprised me. It wasn't a song I knew. It had no rhythm or melody, but it came from somewhere real. I let it go, let it hang in the air until it dissolved. I didn't try to bring it back. It was enough that it had come at all. I watched the seasons shift through that window, watched the leaves curl in on themselves, then fall. Watched the branches stand bare like bones in winter, then stretch again when spring returned. I measured time not by calendars, but by shadows, not by plans, but by mornings. That window became my ritual, my pulse, my daily reminder that the world turned whether or not anyone was watching. And as long as I stood there, coffee in hand, eyes open, breath steady, I hadn't disappeared. Not yet. Not entirely. The phone rang on a Thursday, just after noon. I had just finished washing a dish, a single plate with a smudge of mustard from the sandwich I'd eaten earlier, and I was drying it with the corner of an old t-shirt I used in place of towels. The sound startled me more than it should have. The landline hadn't rung since I'd returned to the house. I'd almost forgotten it was connected. I let it ring twice before answering. Not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to collect my breath. That number was one only a handful of people knew, and most of them were gone. I lifted the receiver with the same weight I might lift an unfamiliar object from the ground, cautious, uncertain. It was Daniel. His voice came through the line, clipped and distant, like he wasn't calling from across town, but from another continent. He used my name too quickly, like it was a formality, not a connection. He asked how I was. I didn't answer. There was a pause. Then he asked where I'd gone, as if I'd vanished, as if I'd been misplaced like a jacket left behind at a restaurant. I said nothing, only breathed into the receiver. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear something faint in the background on his end. A child's voice, a television, the hum of a refrigerator, domestic noises I no longer belonged to. He said they had been worried, that Jenna had wanted to check in, that they weren't sure what I had planned. There was a trace of irritation behind his words, thinly disguised as concern. I could hear the calculation happening in real time, the way his sentences shifted depending on what I did not say. He was feeling his way in the dark, searching not for me, but for the edges of whatever decision I had made. When I still didn't respond, he got to the point. They were having trouble with the sale. The buyers had backed out, apparently. Something about financing or inspections or permits. He said the market had shifted, that the timing had been wrong. He mentioned repairs that would need to be made, upgrades, reinforcements. Every word stacked like bricks on top of each other, building the kind of financial wall he hadn't prepared to climb. He asked, gently at first, if I would be willing to help. Not with labor, not with the actual fixing, with money. A short-term loan, he said, just to float them until things stabilized. Nothing dramatic, nothing unreasonable, just a temporary solution from someone who had once been so good with saving. He tried to sound casual, but his voice betrayed him. It cracked in places, not from emotion, but from pressure. I imagined him standing in the kitchen I no longer entered, pinching the bridge of his nose, trying not to let Jenna hear the urgency in his voice. I said one word, no. Then I hung up. The sound of the receiver landing back in place echoed in the kitchen, like a stone dropped in water. I stood there for a moment, hand still on the phone, not blinking. The house didn't move, the air didn't change, but something inside me settled. I returned to the sink and finished drying the plate. I placed it gently in the cabinet beside the others, all arranged like soldiers, perfectly spaced. The act felt ceremonial, final, like replacing a brick in a wall that had been breached and repaired. The next day, an envelope arrived. No return address. Inside was a letter, typed, printed on clean white paper. It was polite. It was desperate. It was filled with words like misunderstanding, family, responsibility. It outlined debts, bills, interest rates, future plans. I read it twice, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to absorb the full shape of it. I folded it once, then again, then slid it into the back of a drawer filled with rubber bands and spare batteries. I didn't respond. I didn't even keep the envelope. I burned it that night, outside in the fire pit, and watched the paper curl and blacken without sound. In the following days, I thought less about Daniel and more about the rhythm that had returned to my life, the slowness, the quiet, the complete absence of performance. I woke when the sun rose, brewed my coffee, sat at the window, and let the light find me without asking where I'd been. I didn't tell anyone about the call. There was no one to tell, but even if there had been, I wouldn't have. It wasn't about drama or confrontation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about stillness, about reclaiming the right to be left alone, about choosing when and how to speak, and when not to. For the first time in a long while, I slept soundly that week. The kind of sleep that doesn't ask questions. The kind that doesn't drag you backwards into memory. I woke with no alarm, no agenda, no one expecting my attention. The phone rang again 2 days later. I didn't answer, and then it stopped ringing altogether. The folder had been in the bottom drawer of Mary's desk for years. It was made of brown leather, worn smooth at the edges, the corners slightly curled as if from long-held heat. I had opened it once, long ago, when she'd asked me to find a copy of our marriage certificate. Back then, I hadn't paid attention to anything else inside. It was just a folder. Now, in the silence of that small back room, it felt heavier than it should have, as if it had been absorbing time and intentions in secret. The desk sat beneath a window that faced west. The light came in sideways, golden and low in the afternoons. That day, the sun was soft, and the air outside hung with the smell of dust and early spring. I placed the folder on the desk and sat down in the same chair she used to occupy, its cushion still slightly compressed from years of her weight. My hands hesitated before opening it. Not from fear, but from reverence. It was one thing to know she had prepared for what came next. It was another thing entirely to touch the proof. Inside were envelopes, labeled, stacked, methodical. Mary had been precise in everything she did. each section divided by a colored tab, one for the bank account, one for the house title, one for the secondary property deed, one for insurance, one for the foundation we had contributed to once, and then quietly forgotten. Every single paper was accounted for, perfectly aligned, with small notes in the margins in her handwriting, soft, tight script with a leftward tilt. I read through them one by one, slowly, absorbing not just the content, but the decisions behind them. These were not cold legalities. They were acts of foresight, of protection, of love rendered in paper and ink. She had written small comments next to key clauses. Important. Sign in person. Do not include Daniel. Read twice before submitting. They weren't instructions. They were whispers from a place of clarity. At the bottom of the folder was a sealed envelope. My name was on it, in her hand. No address. No date. Just my name. I didn't open it right away. I let it rest beneath my palm as I exhaled and listened to the creak of the house settling. The walls didn't speak, but they pressed inward, aware of what was unfolding. I turned to the last section, a letter from her lawyer, addressed to her, dated 6 months before her death. It confirmed the transfer of the second house to my name only. It acknowledged her decision to remove our son from any future claims. It validated the steps she'd taken to protect the life she suspected might follow her absence. There was no bitterness in it, just clarity. I leaned back in the chair and let the letter rest on my chest. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the small crack in the plaster that curved like a river toward the light fixture. I remembered fixing that once, years ago, after a leak from the roof. It had been a messy job, and Mary had laughed at the way I tried to smooth the plaster with my thumb. Now it had returned, like everything eventually did. I opened the sealed envelope. It wasn't long, a page and a half, handwritten. She had written it in the past tense, as if she already knew I would read it on a quiet day, in solitude. She acknowledged the decisions. She explained why she'd chosen the silence of planning over confrontation. "You have always been a man who understood weight," she wrote. "You carried hoses through burning stairwells without speaking. You carried loss with your shoulders, not your mouth. So I gave you something to carry that would hold you too." I folded the letter gently and slid it back into the envelope. I placed it beneath my shirt, over my chest. I could feel the paper against my skin as I stood and opened the top drawer of the desk. Inside were items untouched since her passing: a pair of reading glasses, a pen that no longer worked, a watch I had given her the year Daniel was born. I left the letter there, folded beside the glasses. I didn't need to reread it. It had done its work. I gathered the legal documents, placed them into a new folder, and tied it with string. I walked to the fire pit in the backyard. The wind had picked up, just enough to stir the dry leaves that had gathered near the base of the fence. I sat for a moment, hands on the folder, listening to the whispering of branches. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vengeful. But I was done letting paper be the only thing that held boundaries in place. I didn't burn the documents. Not yet. But I placed them in a weatherproof box and buried them beneath the stones Mary had once arranged in a circle around her herb garden, a place she had tended with quiet dedication. It felt right that they rest there, not as a secret, but as a foundation no one else could see. That evening, I returned to the kitchen. The window was open, and the scent of rosemary drifted in from the garden. I brewed tea, not because I needed warmth, but because the sound of the kettle helped fill the room without pushing against it. I drank slowly, the heat resting in my chest like a second heartbeat. I didn't write anything in my notebook that day. I didn't need to. The silence itself had been recorded in action, not words. Later, I folded an old dish towel and placed it on the windowsill where the light still touched the edge of the counter. I rested my hand there and watched it glow in the fading gold. Some things did not require proof. They simply remained. It started with a letter, thin and official-looking, slipped through the slot without sound. I found it on the floor near the front door, folded and creased where it had landed on the rug. The envelope bore no return address, but I knew from the paper alone what kind of message it carried. There was a stillness in those envelopes, a kind of forced politeness that masked something heavier underneath. I picked it up with the same slow movement I used to handle burning debris in my firefighting days, not out of fear, but out of habit. Inside was a formal notice, a change of title. The address of the house I had once lived in now belonged to someone else. A name I didn't recognize was listed as the new owner. It didn't sting the way it might have weeks before. The ache had dulled to a distant pulse, like an old scar that only flares in the rain. I read it once, folded it again, and set it in the drawer beside the window. I didn't need to keep it, but I didn't feel like throwing it away either. It wasn't the contents that mattered. It was the finality. The next day, I walked past the old house. I hadn't planned to. I'd taken the long route through town to buy a tin of coffee and a few candles, and without meaning to, my feet followed the familiar path until I was 3 houses away. The yard looked different. The overgrown hedge had been trimmed back. The broken swing on the porch had been removed. There were 2 bicycles leaning against the railing, small, bright, plastic, with training wheels and streamers. The front door was wide open, not just ajar, but fully open, like an invitation or an announcement. A breeze carried voices into the street, light, cheerful, unfamiliar. I slowed my pace. I didn't stop. I kept my hands in my pockets and my gaze soft. I didn't want to appear curious, though I was. Curious in the way you glance back at a building after it's burned down and been rebuilt. You know the walls aren't the same, but some part of you wants to confirm it. The windows had been washed. The curtains were new. A smell of fresh paint hung in the air, faint but sharp. Through the open door, I saw boxes stacked along the hallway wall, a lamp with no shade, a rolled-up rug, and a woman kneeling on the floor assembling a piece of furniture with an Allen wrench. She hummed as she worked. A child laughed somewhere deeper in the house. I walked past without being seen. That night, I sat on the porch of my own home, my second home, the one no one else knew about. The air was cooler than usual. The stars scattered across the sky in a silence that asked nothing of me. I sipped tea from a chipped mug and thought about the doors that open and close throughout a life. Some slam shut, others drift until they're quietly forgotten. But sometimes, someone leaves one open, and you're given a glimpse into a world you no longer belong to. The old house was no longer mine, not legally, not emotionally. It had become a structure, a shape inhabited by strangers who didn't know the sound of Mary's laugh echoing off the kitchen walls, who'd never watched the sunrise from the back steps in winter, who'd never stood in the laundry room during a thunderstorm, listening to the patter on the roof like distant applause. They would make new memories in those rooms, carve new grooves into the floorboards, argue in different corners, cry on unfamiliar couches. And that was how it should be. Still, there was something unsettling about seeing the front door open like that. The openness felt too easy, as if what had once been so hard to leave behind could now be entered without resistance. As if the house had simply shrugged us off and made space for the next performance. But I reminded myself that houses forget. They're not museums. They adapt. The walls absorb new stories, and the old ones fade like pencil on sunlit paper. The following morning, I received another envelope. This one was thicker, with handwriting I recognized, though barely. The return address was scribbled hastily in Daniel's script. Inside was a short letter. It was polite, tentative. He mentioned the house sale again, said things were finally falling into place, that they had moved in with Jenna's cousin temporarily, that Molly was adjusting to the new environment. He added that he had driven by the old property and noticed a few things still unresolved. I wasn't sure what that meant. I folded the letter and placed it beside the first one. I sat at the table for a long time that day. The light shifted across the room slowly, spilling gold onto the floor tiles. I didn't move. I let the stillness cover me like a second skin. I thought about the phrase "open door" and all the ways it could be interpreted: invitation, transition, escape, vulnerability. I had closed so many doors in my life, some with care, some with force. But the ones I remembered most were the ones left open, just long enough for someone to change their mind. In the afternoon, I took a walk, not toward the old neighborhood, but through the streets I hadn't yet explored. I passed empty lots, half-finished renovations, corner shops I'd never noticed. I walked until my legs grew tired and the sun dipped low. I returned home, unlocked my door, and stepped inside to the smell of quiet and the weight of air that hadn't been disturbed. The next time I passed the old house, the door was shut. A wreath had been hung on it. Green, plastic, out of season. I smiled at the absurdity of it. I imagined Mary laughing at the tackiness, nudging me to say something clever. I kept walking, hands in my pockets, head down. I didn't need to look again. That door was no longer mine. Back in my kitchen, I opened the window. The air smelled of earth and rain. I brewed coffee though it was late, and sat in the glow of a lamp whose bulb had begun to flicker. I let it flicker, let it struggle for a steady light. There was something honest in its effort. Some doors close with a bang, some with a whisper, and some stay open just long enough for you to understand why you walked away. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of late spring day where the light settled just right across the tops of the trees and the air carried that faint scent of dust and cut grass. I had been sweeping the porch, not because it needed it, but because the rhythm of the broom helped anchor my thoughts. The bristles scraped softly over the boards, stirring nothing more than dried leaves and the occasional dead insect. I wasn't thinking of anything in particular when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. The sound was unfamiliar in this part of the neighborhood. Most of the homes were spaced apart, and traffic rarely wandered through without purpose. I paused with the broom in hand, leaning against the railing as a silver SUV pulled slowly up to the curb. Its windows were tinted, but the silhouette of two people in the front was unmistakable. I didn't move. I didn't wave. When the door opened, Daniel stepped out. He looked older than I remembered, or maybe just heavier with worry. His jacket was wrinkled, the collar slightly curled up like he'd slept in it. His hair, always so carefully styled, now seemed tired of effort. He stood by the vehicle for a moment, then walked slowly toward the house. Behind him, Jenna stepped out as well. She held her arms crossed over her chest, sunglasses on, her mouth a straight, unreadable line. They both stopped at the bottom of the steps. There was no script, no gifts, no prepared lines of apology or deflection, just silence. I stood with the broom still in my hand, letting the air stretch between us. The wind moved gently through the branches, pushing the shadows around like slow waves on the porch floor. Daniel cleared his throat. I didn't respond. He looked over at Jenna, who gave a small shake of her head. Then he turned his eyes back to mine and said my name. He spoke of mistakes, of things said in haste, of actions misunderstood. He mentioned stress, the weight of the sale, the chaos that followed my leaving. He used words like regret and clarity and moving forward. Jenna stayed mostly quiet, her arms still wrapped tight around herself like armor. But when Daniel finished, she added a few lines. About family, about time, about not letting things end like this. They were careful, measured, not overly emotional, not demanding. But behind their words, I could hear the weight of something else, something pressing in from behind them, invisible but insistent. The kind of pressure that doesn't come from the heart, but from consequences. Financial ones, most likely. Practical ones. The realization that I was not as disposable as they'd believed. Or maybe the realization that I had left, truly left, and didn't intend to come back. I didn't answer. I walked slowly down the steps, past them both, and toward the side gate that led to the garden. I didn't invite them in. I didn't ask them to follow. But they did. The garden had changed since they last saw it. I had cleared the weeds, restructured the beds, and planted herbs that reminded me of Mary's cooking. Rosemary, thyme, sage. The air smelled of earth and green things. The bench under the maple tree was where I sat every afternoon now, watching the light filter through the leaves. I took my seat on the bench. Daniel remained standing. Jenna stayed near the path, arms finally lowered, but her posture still guarded. They waited for me to say something. I looked out at the garden. I thought of all the things I could say. The years we had given them, the rooms we had built, the sacrifices, the softness that turned brittle, the dinner tables where conversation became correction, the slow shifting of respect into something transactional. But I said none of that. I didn't need to. I pointed to the garden bed, nearest the porch. Daniel followed my gaze. There, growing steady and green, was a row of basil. At the base of the row, I had placed a small wooden marker. Nothing fancy, just a hand-carved tag with the word Mary etched into it. Beneath the soil was the letter she'd written to me, buried like a root. I let the silence speak for me. After a long minute, Daniel nodded. Once. Slowly. Then he turned to leave. Jenna followed. They didn't say goodbye. I watched them walk back to the car, get in, and drive off without looking back. The sound of the engine faded quickly, absorbed by the trees. The garden was still. The air was calm. I stood, returned to the porch, and leaned the broom against the wall. Then I went back inside. The tea kettle was still warm. I poured a cup and carried it to the window, where the light was shifting again, golden and low. I took one sip, and then another. And then I closed the door. It began like all the other days had in recent weeks, with the soft hush of morning light spilling through the kitchen window and the quiet tick of the wall clock that had grown irregular, but never fully stopped. I awoke before the alarm I no longer used, letting the hush of the early hours settle over my chest like a second blanket. My joints ached more than usual, but not in protest, more like a reminder, a way of saying, "You are still here." I moved slowly through my routine. The floorboards in the hallway groaned underfoot, familiar and forgiving. I made my coffee the way I always had, with the last spoonful of grounds from the tin. It would need to be refilled, but not today. Today, I would not leave the house. The world outside had gone quieter lately. Spring was softening into early summer, and the neighborhood had begun to quiet in the way only heat could demand. I opened the window just a crack, enough to let the scent of the earth drift in, warm soil, blooming jasmine, a faint hint of pine. The wind carried no voices, no barking dogs, no bicycles screeching across the pavement. It felt like the air itself had agreed to stay still. I didn't speak that day. I had nothing I needed to say. I didn't play the radio, didn't answer the phone, didn't hum the half melodies that sometimes found their way up from memory. There was a strange comfort in the absence of sound, like being submerged in water without holding your breath. I walked through the house slowly, passing my hand along the edge of the hallway wall, letting my fingertips catch on the small imperfections in the paint, chips, scratches, the slight warp where furniture had once rubbed too long in one place. The house was old enough now to carry memory in its bones, and I liked being reminded that even plaster and wood remembered where people had been. In the living room, I sat in my chair by the window and watched the shadows shift across the floor. A bird landed on the railing just outside, black-capped, cautious, curious. It tilted its head once, then twice, as if listening for something I couldn't hear. After a few moments it flew off, and the railing resumed its role as a silent observer. The notebook sat open on the table beside me, a clean page, waiting. I didn't write anything. I held the pen loosely between my fingers, but found no urgency in the gesture. There would be time for writing later, or there wouldn't. Either outcome felt acceptable. I spent part of the afternoon in the garden, not working it, just walking the paths I had worn with time. The herbs had filled out nicely, spilling over the edges of the beds, fragrant and unruly. The rosemary bush had begun to lean westward, drawn toward the heavier sun, and the thyme crept across the stones like it had something to whisper to the ground. I crouched once to brush my fingers through the basil. The scent bloomed instantly, sharp, sweet, familiar. I didn't pick any. I let it be. A bee buzzed lazily nearby, too drowsy to sting, more interested in the blossoms than in me. I watched it drift from leaf to leaf, its wings catching light like glass. Back inside, I made lunch without sound. Bread, an apple, a piece of hard cheese I found in the back of the fridge. I ate at the kitchen table with the window open, the breeze lifting the edge of the tablecloth just slightly. It reminded me of something. A picnic blanket, a day in the park, Mary's laugh carried by wind. The memory passed through me without pain. It was no longer something to grieve, just something that had once been. I didn't check the mailbox. I didn't turn on any lights. I moved only with the sun, shifting from room to room as the shadows followed. I stood in the hallway for a long time, staring at the small frame that held an old photograph of us. Me, Mary, Daniel as a boy. We looked young, or maybe just lighter. It wasn't sadness I felt looking at it. It was distance, as if watching someone else's memory, a scene from a film I knew by heart, but hadn't revisited in years. When the sun began to dip, I lit the candle on the windowsill, the same one I'd been burning for days now, letting it shrink slowly. It gave off a soft, steady glow, just enough to keep the room from slipping into complete darkness. I sat beside it with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the quiet that came not from absence, but from stillness earned. I thought of all the noise that had once filled my days, the alarms, the voices, the hammering of nails, the clash of pots, the laughter and arguments, the clang of keys dropped on the counter, the sharp snap of doors closing. I didn't miss it. I didn't long for the volume to return. There was something sacred in the hush that had taken its place. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt complete. It wasn't waiting for anything. It wasn't preparing to be broken. It simply was. When I went to bed that night, I left the window cracked, letting the outside air seep in and mingle with the darkness. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling, the candle's glow flickering against the paint. The sheets were cool. The pillow smelled faintly of cedar. I closed my eyes and listened, and the house for once breathed with me. I woke just after dawn, before the birds had gathered the energy to sing, before the world had fully remembered itself. The room was cool and filled with that gray-blue softness that only existed for a short time each morning, suspended between night's wait and day's noise. I didn't move at first. I lay still beneath the blanket, eyes open, breathing slowly. The air tasted like the garden, earthy, damp, with a trace of mint from the herbs near the window. It was quiet. Not the silence of absence, but the quiet of balance. I had come to understand the difference. There had been silences that pressed in on me like fog, thick and withholding. And there was this, what filled the room now, a silence that gave space, not emptiness. A silence that breathed with me, not against me. When I finally sat up, I did so without thought, like a tree adjusting to the wind. I moved through the house slowly. There was no reason to hurry. The kettle still whistled like it always had, though a little softer now, as if it too had aged into something gentler. I brewed tea, not for alertness, but for warmth. The first sip didn't rush through me like it once did. It lingered, coating my throat, anchoring me in the moment. I opened the back door and stepped outside, barefoot. The stone was cool beneath my feet. The garden had grown wild in places, but not in a way that needed correction. The plants leaned into each other like old friends who didn't mind the closeness. Bees moved among the lavender and thyme with lazy purpose, and the wind played lightly through the branches, touching each leaf without disturbing the whole. I stood there, just breathing. I had read somewhere, long ago, that grief lived in the lungs, that it changed the shape of the breath, shortened it, made the chest feel tight. That made sense to me now. I remembered the months after Mary's diagnosis, when each inhale felt like it needed permission. The year after her death, when breathing itself seemed like something to apologize for. Even in those moments of calm, I had never been able to fill my lungs fully. But now, I could. I drew in air until my chest ached, held it, then let it go slowly. Again, and again. With each breath, I felt the shape of my life return. Not the life I had left behind, but the one I was quietly making room for. It wasn't grand, it wasn't loud, but it was mine. Inside, I dusted the shelves, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to feel the curve of the wood beneath my hands. I watered the plants on the windowsill. I folded the linens that had dried overnight. I wiped the kitchen counter, pausing where the morning light caught the scratches in the surface, each one a memory pressed into form. I thought of Daniel. I thought of Jenna. Not with anger, not with longing, but with the kind of quiet distance that let memory be what it was, unchanged, untended. A photograph left in a drawer, no longer needing to be framed. I imagined them moving forward, reshaping their world without me in the center of it. I imagined them explaining my absence in vague terms, perhaps with a shrug, perhaps with a sentence that trailed off. I didn't mind. People made sense of things however they could. It was not my job to help them understand the choices I had made. It was only my job to live with them, and I had. That afternoon, I walked farther than usual, through the trees, past the creek that had dried to a trickle, and along the edge of a field where birds gathered in the tall grass. I didn't bring anything with me. I didn't wear a watch. Time passed in shadows and temperature, and the sun rose behind me, fell ahead of me, and when I returned home, the light had turned golden and thick, casting the house in a gentle haze. I made dinner without thinking. Just a few things from the pantry, enough to fill the plate, not enough to make noise. I ate with the window open, the candle on the sill flickering in the breeze. Somewhere in the distance, wind chimes rang, not mine, but a neighbor's, or perhaps carried from farther away. I sat on the porch until the sky darkened fully. Stars blinked into view one by one, scattered and imperfect, like everything else that mattered. I leaned back, felt the wood of the chair hold me, felt the weight of the day release itself from my shoulders. It was then, in that deep stillness, that I realized something simple and true. I was no longer waiting, not for closure, not for return, not even for peace. I had arrived, not in a place, but in a state, in a knowing, in an understanding that nothing more needed to happen for this life to be complete. It didn't require applause or explanation. It didn't require anyone else to bear witness. The air moved gently across my face. I breathed in, and then I stayed still.